The snowstorm howled like a wounded beast, swirling across the empty road in thick, blinding sheets. Daniel's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his jaw clenched as tightly as his heart. The drive home from the cemetery was always long, but tonight it felt endless. His wife's name was still fresh on the headstone, the memory of her laughter drowned beneath the bitter wind. He had promised her he'd keep going, but how could he? The loneliness clawed at him, and the blizzard outside felt like a cruel reflection of the storm raging inside. The wipers scraped against the windshield, barely keeping up with the relentless snowfall. His headlights carved a narrow tunnel of light through the storm. Then, suddenly, something flickered in the road ahead. A shape, indistinct, unmoving. His breath caught in his throat. A trick of the snow. A fallen branch. But as he drew closer, unease crawled up his spine. It wasn't just a snowdrift. It was something, or someone. Daniel's foot hovered over the brake. He squinted, straining against the darkness. Whatever it wasn't moving. He rolled down the window. A blast of wind tore into the car, cutting through his jacket, stealing his breath. The storm roared in his ears, but beneath it silence, his gut twisted. He knew this feeling well, the weight of an unseen urgency, the kind of moment where hesitation could mean everything. A battle waged inside him. It was late. It was freezing. He was tired, but some instincts never fade. With a deep breath, Daniel shoved open the door. Snow crunched under his boots as he stepped into the frozen abyss. The wind pressed against him like an invisible wall, but he pushed forward, each step toward the shape tightening the knot in his chest. What was he about to find? He was close now. Close enough to see it. A dog. A German shepherd, curled into itself, barely breathing. Snow had begun to bury its limp body, its fur frozen stiff. Daniel's throat tightened. Was he too late? The thought sent a pang of helplessness through him, something he'd felt too often lately. Then, ever so slightly, the dog's chest rose, a faint, struggling breath. The storm raged on, but deep inside, Daniel knew. He couldn't walk away. Daniel knelt in the snow, his breath heavy, the icy wind biting at his exposed skin. His hands hovered over the limp German shepherd, unsure if he was too late. Then, barely audible over the howling storm, a faint whimper. A fragile, desperate sound. His chest tightened. The dog was still alive, but just barely. The snow clung to its fur, ice stiffening the strands. The sound of its shallow breathing, uneven and strained, sent a jolt of urgency through him. He couldn't stand by, not this time. He had to do something. Now. Brushing away the snow, Daniel's fingers met fur that was too thin, ribs protruding sharply beneath the shepherd's fragile frame. It shivered violently, its muscles twitching with exhaustion. No collar, no tags, just patches of frost covering its trembling body. His jaw clenched. How long has this dog been out here? Has it been abandoned, lost? He scanned the empty road, searching for a sign of an owner. But there was nothing. No footprints, no shelter. Just the endless, merciless cold. As Daniel reached out, the past surged forward like a ghost from the snow. Maximum, his childhood dog, the one he couldn't save. He could still hear his mother's voice, cracking as she told him, "We were too late." The helplessness, the guilt, that feeling of watching something slip away, knowing you should have done more. He swallowed hard, shaking the memory from his mind. Not again. He wouldn't let this dog suffer the same fate. Not while he could still do something. His fingers brushed against the shepherd's ice-coated ear. "Hold on, buddy," he murmured. A beam of light pierced through the thick curtain of snow. Headlights. A car, No, a truck, moving fast. Daniel tensed, his gut twisted with uncertainty. Could this be the person who left the dog here? Or just another driver caught in the storm? The vehicle didn't slow. It roared forward, barreling down the icy road. A lump formed in Daniel's throat. If the driver didn't see them in time, if they didn't stop, both he and the shepherd could end up as nothing more than another tragedy lost in the blizzard. Daniel's body moved before his mind could catch up. He scooped the dog into his arms, its weight alarmingly light. The shepherd let out a weak whine, but didn't resist. No time to second guess. The headlights were getting closer. He turned and ran, boots slipping on the ice, each breath burning his lungs. His truck wasn't far, but the snow made every step feel like a battle. He clenched the dog tighter, heart hammering. Just a little further. Just a little more. Daniel threw open the truck door, cradling the dog as he climbed in. He cranked the heat, shoving the snow-covered blankets aside. The shepherd curled against his chest, its body barely registering warmth. Too cold, too weak. He gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel with one hand as he sped onto the icy road. "Stay with me," he muttered, glancing down. The dog's eyes fluttered open for just a second before slipping shut again. Daniel's fingers tightened. He didn't know if the shepherd would make it, but he wasn't going to let it die alone. Not tonight. Daniel gently places the trembling dog on a soft blanket near the fireplace, careful not to startle him. Shadow's ribs show beneath his matted fur, and his body shivers despite the warmth surrounding him. "It's okay, buddy. You're safe now," Daniel murmurs, his voice barely above a whisper. But Shadow flinches at every movement, when Daniel reaches for a towel, when the wind rattles the window, when the flames crackle in the hearth. His deep brown eyes dart around the room, searching for danger. Daniel exhales slowly. He's seen fear like this before, raw, deep-seated, the kind that doesn't fade overnight. So he moves carefully, speaking gently, making no sudden gestures. Healing takes time. He knows that all too well. As Daniel studies the dog's gaze, something about it pulls at him, a mix of fear and resilience, like a shadow lingering in the corners of a dark room, uncertain whether to step into the light. "Shadow," he says softly, testing the name. The dog doesn't react, but Daniel knows it fits. Shadow had lived unseen, unnoticed, forgotten. But now, he wasn't just a shadow in the snow, he was here. He repeats the name again, slower this time. "Shadow." The dog lifts his head slightly, his ears twitching. It's not much, but it's a start. The first few days pass in silence. Shadow barely moves from the blanket, his wary eyes following Daniel's every step. He eats, but only when Daniel is at a distance. He drinks, but never lets his guard down. Then, one evening, as Daniel sets a bowl of warm broth near him, Shadow hesitates, then takes a step forward. Just one. Daniel holds his breath. Shadow lowers his head and licks at the broth. When he finishes, he lifts his gaze and wags his tail, just once, a single hesitant movement. Daniel's chest tightens. It isn't much, but in the language of a broken soul, it's everything. Daniel wasn't used to talking much, not since Laura passed. The house had become a quiet place, filled only with the creaking of wood and the occasional wind against the windows. But now, with Shadow curled near the fireplace, something shifts. "You wouldn't believe how cold it gets out here in the winters," Daniel says, stirring his coffee. "Laura used to make the best damn hot chocolate. Would have given anything for another cup." Shadow watches him, head slightly tilted. Daniel chuckles dryly. "You probably don't care about hot chocolate, huh?" Shadow blinks. For the first time in a long while, Daniel doesn't feel like he's talking to himself. The first time Daniel clips a leash onto Shadow's collar, the dog tenses but doesn't pull away. A small victory. They walk slowly along the tree-lined trail behind the house. Shadow stays close, ears perked, his deep brown eyes flicking up to Daniel every few steps, as if trying to understand this newfound companionship. Daniel talks to him as they go, about the cold, about the way the lake freezes over, about the deer that sometimes wander near the porch. Shadow listens, or maybe he doesn't, but he stays, and that's enough. One evening, as Daniel runs a brush gently through Shadow's tangled fur, his fingers pause over something rough, a scar. It runs deep along his shoulder, a jagged mark cutting through his dark coat. Daniel's throat tightens. "Someone hurt you," he murmurs, more to himself than to Shadow. The dog stiffens beneath his touch, his body going rigid. Daniel doesn't push. He simply continues brushing, slower this time. He knows what it's like to carry wounds that don't heal with time, to flinch at memories that refuse to fade. Shadow exhales a heavy, tired breath, and after a moment he leans, just slightly, into Daniel's touch. Daniel swallows hard. He doesn't say anything. He just keeps brushing. The night is still when it happens. Daniel is reading in his chair, Shadow curled at his feet, when a deep, guttural growl cuts through the silence. Daniel stiffens. He's never heard Shadow growl before. The dog is rigid, his ears flat against his head, his eyes locked on the window. The hair along his back bristles. Daniel follows his gaze. A shadow shifts beyond the trees, a figure. His pulse spikes. Someone is out there, watching. He stands slowly, his eyes never leaving the dark silhouette beyond the glass. Shadow's growl deepens, a low, protective warning. Daniel steps closer to the window, his heart pounding. Whoever it is, they're not just passing through, and they're not alone. The shadowy figure lingers just beyond the reach of the porch light, his stance rigid, his face obscured by darkness. For a moment, neither Daniel nor Shadow move, both frozen in place. Then, with a slight shift, the figure retreats, melting into the night like a ghost. But Daniel's gut churns with unease. This wasn't a random passerby. The way he stood there, watching, waiting, it meant something. Shadow, still tense beside him, lets out a low, uneasy whine. Daniel rests a hand on the dog's back. "I don't think this is over, buddy," he murmurs. And he's right. The next day, as Daniel and Shadow stroll through town, the crisp morning air does little to shake the lingering unease. Shadow trots beside him, ears perked, tail wagging slightly, until he suddenly freezes. His entire body goes rigid, his breathing sharp and shallow. Then, in a move Daniel has never seen before, Shadow ducks behind him, pressing his trembling frame against Daniel's legs. Daniel follows Shadow's gaze and spots him. A man in a heavy coat, his eyes locked onto them with something unreadable, something dark. A smirk curls on his lips as he steps closer. Shadow lets out a barely audible whimper. The man stops a few feet away, his stance relaxed but his eyes sharp. "That's my dog," he says, his voice laced with smug confidence. "Been looking for him." Daniel stiffens. The way Shadow is cowering, the way his body vibrates with fear, it tells Daniel everything he needs to know. This man isn't a long-lost owner. He's something worse. The man's gaze flickers with arrogance, as if he expects Daniel to simply hand Shadow over. He even chuckles. "Bet he was a real mess when you found him. Guess I should thank you for keeping him warm." Daniel doesn't move. Neither does Shadow. Daniel feels it before he sees it. Shadow's trembling form pressing closer, his fur brushing against Daniel's leg, and then he looks down, Wide, fearful eyes lock onto his, silently pleading, "Don't let him take me." Daniel swallows hard. There's no bark, no growl, no sound at all, just Shadow's eyes, filled with desperation, with trust. A trust Daniel refuses to betray. He looks up at the man, jaw tightening. He already knows his answer. There's no way in hell he's giving Shadow up. Daniel straightens his posture, his voice firm and unwavering. "You abandoned him." The man scoffs, stuffing his hands in his coat pockets. "That's a bold accusation. I don't need proof. The way he's looking at you is enough." Shadow doesn't move, doesn't blink, just stays pressed against Daniel's side like he knows his fate hangs in the balance. The man steps closer, lowering his voice. "I could take him back, right now." Daniel doesn't flinch. "Try it." The man lunges, fingers stretching toward Shadow's collar. It happens fast, too fast for Daniel to react. But Shadow does. For the first time, he doesn't shrink away, he doesn't cower. Instead, a deep, rumbling growl escapes his throat, and in an instant his teeth are bared. A warning, a promise. The man jerks his hand back, his smirk vanishing. Shadow plants himself firmly between Daniel and the man, shoulders squared, growl growing louder. Daniel can hardly believe it. The once frightened dog who flinched at every movement is standing his ground. Not for himself, but for Daniel. The street is eerily quiet. People glance their way, sensing the tension. Daniel meets the man's glare head-on, unfazed. He's been in burning buildings, faced life-or-death moments. This question mark, this is nothing. The man's jaw clenches, his fingers twitching at his side. But Daniel doesn't move, neither does Shadow. The message is clear, this fight won't be easy. A beat of silence, then another. The man exhales sharply through his nose. "You're making a mistake," he mutters. Daniel doesn't blink. "Number you did, when you let him go." Just as the man takes another step forward, a firm voice cuts through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" A uniformed officer stands nearby, hand resting on his belt, eyes sharp. The man hesitates, his bravado faltering for the first time. Daniel stays calm but doesn't move an inch. "He's trying to steal my dog," the man says, slipping easily into a rehearsed lie. Daniel shakes his head. "Shadow belongs to me now, and if you have any real claim, I suggest you prove it." The officer's gaze shifts between them. "Let's settle this properly." For a long moment, Daniel braces for a fight. But then the man's face twists with barely contained anger. He knows he's lost, for now. With a sharp, frustrated exhale, he spits out a curse under his breath and turns on his heel. "This isn't over," he hisses, before disappearing into the crowd. Daniel doesn't breathe until he's gone. He looks down at Shadow, who is still standing firm, ears back, but no longer shaking. For the first time, Daniel swears he sees something new in those brown eyes. Courage. Later that day, Daniel files a report, making it official. No one is taking Shadow away. Not now. Not ever. As they walk home, Shadow stays close, his steps matching Daniel's perfectly. The weight of the encounter lingers, but something else fills its place. Determination. Daniel stops outside his front door, kneeling beside Shadow. He runs a hand over the dog's fur, voice soft but firm. "No one's ever going to hurt you again, that's a promise." Shadow's tail wags, just once. But it's enough. The ruling came down swiftly. Shadow's former owner had a record of neglect and cruelty. The authorities had dug into his past and uncovered a pattern of mistreatment, enough to strip him of any right to claim the dog. Daniel stood in the courthouse hallway, his hands clenched into fists as he listened to the final verdict. Shadow sat by his side, his ears perked but his body tense, as if he understood that his fate hung in the balance. "The dog remains with you," the officer confirmed. "He's safe now." Daniel exhaled, relief flooding through him. He looked down at Shadow, who gazed up at him with trusting eyes. "You're home, buddy," Daniel murmured, ruffling the fur on his head. For the first time, Shadow's tail wagged. The adoption papers lay on the desk before Daniel, a final step that would make everything official. His fingers trembled slightly as he signed his name at the bottom of the document. Shadow was no longer just a stray dog who had wandered into his life. He was family. Daniel slid the papers back to the shelter worker, who smiled warmly. "Congratulations. Shadow's yours." Daniel looked down at the dog beside him, feeling a warmth spread through his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Looks like you're stuck with me now," he said. Shadow let out a contented sigh and leaned into Daniel's side. Nights used to be the hardest. Shadow would flinch at sudden sounds, curl up in the farthest corner of the room, as if expecting to be hurt. But not tonight. Tonight, he rested with his head on Daniel's lap, his deep breaths slow and steady. Daniel ran his fingers through Shadow's fur, marveling at the trust that had grown between them. "You're safe," Daniel whispered. "No one's ever gonna hurt you again." Shadow let out a soft huff, his eyes fluttering closed. The silent understanding between them spoke louder than words. They had both found something they never expected: peace. Winter faded, giving way to the first warmth of spring. The ice had melted, both in the town and in Daniel's heart. For so long, he had lived with ghosts of the past, with the weight of memories that refused to let him breathe. But now, as he watched Shadow chase a butterfly across the yard, his once fearful dog now fearless, Daniel felt something shift within himself. Healing didn't happen all at once, but sometimes it came in the form of a four-legged companion who refused to give up on you. Daniel stood on the hill overlooking the town, the sunset painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Shadow sat beside him, ears perked, eyes fixed on the horizon. "We made it, didn't we?" Daniel murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ear. The dog let out a happy bark, as if in agreement. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't just surviving, he was living. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't face it alone. With Shadow by his side, the road ahead didn't seem so daunting anymore. Together, they had found home. Shadow lay beside Daniel, his eyes filled with a quiet trust that once seemed impossible. The scars of his past remained, but they no longer defined him. Daniel reached down, running his fingers through the dog's thick fur. A life once discarded had found warmth, safety, and love. And in rescuing Shadow, Daniel had unknowingly saved himself. True compassion, he realized, wasn't just about saving a life. It was about changing it, nurturing it, and standing by it no matter what. Daniel never thought he'd find purpose again. The weight of loneliness had consumed him, leaving him hollow. But every morning, as Shadow nudged him awake, he felt a flicker of something new: hope. It was in Shadow's wagging tail, in his watchful eyes, in the way he leaned against him on the coldest nights. Their bond wasn't just about companionship, it was survival, healing, and a silent promise never to be alone again. Saving Shadow had been the easy part. The real challenge was earning his trust, proving that love could be patient, gentle, and without conditions. Shadow had flinched at raised voices, cowered at sudden movements, but Daniel never gave up. A true hero, he realized, wasn't just someone who rescued another. It was someone who stayed, through the fear, the setbacks, and the doubts. And as Shadow finally rested his head on Daniel's lap, Daniel knew. They had saved each other. Daniel once thought second chances were for other people, not for someone as broken as him. But Shadow had needed one too. And together they found what they had lost: trust, love, and a place to call home. As they sat on the porch, the sun setting before them, Daniel exhaled. "We made it, boy," he whispered. Shadow lifted his head, eyes shining with understanding. Yes, they had.